Okay, this is lesson 93, and we're now going to look at the balance of payments. Just a few things that you should know about the balance of payments. In the UK, over the last 30 years, we've had a trade deficit for 29 out of those 30 years. Our last trade surplus was in the year 1997. America's been running quite a large trade deficit for years and years and years. It's about 7% of GDP. In the year 2014, the UK had a record trade deficit of 5%. Now, traditionally, one way of getting rid of a trade deficit or reducing a trade deficit has been, if there is a recession, you're less likely to have a trade deficit because you'll be importing fewer goods. However, conditions are so bad in the UK in terms of the trade deficit macro objective that even when we had a recession, we still ran a quite a large trade deficit, although not as large as it's previously been. So why is our trade deficit now minus 5%? Well, I'm going to explain that on the board in a second or two, and I think I have done it previously in a previous lesson. But what we're now technically doing is we're going through all the different parts of the syllabus on the trade section. Okay, so as an A-level economics student, you should have a very clear idea in your head, and for the AS course, of exactly what is in the current account. And I've just used on here an example of FDI just to bring that home a wee bit. But you've got trading goods, trading services, net investment income and transfers, and then we have the current account. Now in the UK right now, we import more than we export, so that is called a current account deficit. It can also actually be called a trade deficit, and sometimes it'll be called a balance of payments deficit. It's just useful to know what all those words, what they really mean is a current account deficit. Our trade deficit, current account deficit, balance of payments deficit is about minus £70 billion, which is roughly 5% of GDP. Now, why has it suddenly got worse? I've explained this already, but the reason is this used to be always plus £20 billion, but recently it's gone to minus £20 billion. And that's simply because we're not earning as much as we did from our investments abroad. So we're getting less profits are coming back into the UK from those investments. But that's quite serious for the UK, because normally the trading goods is obviously always negative because our manufacturing sector is only 10% of GDP, is quite small. We're very good at the services, banking, insurance, education, right? But this is always, we have always done well in terms of net investment income. But not anymore. It's minus £20 billion, and then we've got transfers to the EU, which is always negative. So that is our current account. Then we've got two other parts of the account. Two other parts below that. We have the capital account, which is really, really small, which you can almost ignore really, but it's just if immigrants come into the UK, they bring money in with them, then that is calculated as being part of the capital account. I think it's about £4 billion a year when you look at the whole of this account here, which is absolutely tiny, really. But then we got the financial account, which is really, really important. Now, a lot of that is made up of portfolio investment. Is if we invest and buy shares in a Brazilian company abroad, then that will be known as money going out of the UK, and then the profits and dividends would actually come back to the net investment income account, but that'd be money going abroad. Or particularly recently, we got a lot of investment has come into the UK, so people are buying shares of UK companies or whatever. A big part of this is foreign direct investment. Now, as we know on the course, the UK has been very, very good. Sorry, just moving the computer. The UK, otherwise it won't save. The UK is very, very good. Sorry, just so you know right now. Right, I'm creating this talking textbook. So I'm filming this myself, editing it myself, watching the computer to see it uploads, and I try and do it all at the same time. Otherwise, each film can take about an hour and a bit. This one takes a little bit longer because it's all on trade. Anyway, so we attract lots of foreign direct investment into the UK, and this helps to pay for our current account deficit. And it's really, really important. If we didn't have that, I think we'd be in big trouble. Or we can either borrow money, which we don't really want to do, or we can attract hot money into the UK, but the trouble with hot money if it does come into the UK, it can very, very quickly leave the UK again. So, but we haven't been attracting a lot of hot money recently because our rate of interest is so low. Okay. But if we do attract foreign direct investment, that comes in through the financial account, and that will help to pay for the current account deficit. Of course, it will also increase our exports. And you may or may not know last year, but overall we exported more, no, that's more cars. In terms of value, we exported more cars than we imported. And that was the first time ever for X number of years. And that's obviously because of Tata taking over Jaguar, Land Rover and Nissan, etc, etc. So that's foreign direct investment, which is really, really important for the UK. So not only does it increase exports for the UK, it also helps to pay for our trade deficit. The problems with it is that the profits will go back to the country that's made that investment, so that be Tata's profits or Nissan's profits. Okay, so that is the current account. The capital account is really, really small. That's just immigrants bringing in financial capital. Obviously very important for them, but in the big picture of things, pretty small. I'm just looking up on this booklet on here. It's so small, right? Right, this is the difference between a talking textbook and what I do. You can read all of this, or you can watch about 50 to 60 hours worth of videos on me talking through A-level economics. But this tiny bit here is the capital account, and this is the financial account here. It's just massive compared to the little capital account. Okay, 3 parts of balance of payments. What factors will influence our balance of payments? How many goods we sell abroad, productivity, inflation and the exchange rate. In this year's A2 exam for AQA, they asked, I thought it was quite a nasty question actually, saying how does global inflation affect the UK balance of payments? Woo. And all I could really think of when I heard the question, my students came up to me and said, sir, that question was a little bit weird. Why is it that global inflation, how will that affect the balance of payments? I was thinking, why did you answer that question? When this previous question was, should the UK stay or leave the European Union? Anyway, if you think about it, if we got lower inflation than Germany, then we will sell more exports, and then you can talk about we want export-led growth and we sell more exports to multiply accelerator. However, if our inflation rate is higher than everyone else's inflation rate, then we're going to be in trouble because we will lose competitiveness. However, okay, that could be sort of sorted out partially, helped up by the fall in the exchange rate. However, it's not a good thing. The other big factor is that we would import a lot of inflation. So if the oil price goes up, let's take Jeff Rubin's argument, let's say the oil price shoots up to $200 a barrel, $300 a barrel, $500 a barrel or whatever, we tend in the short term to have an inelastic demand for oil. So therefore we're still going to buy more oil, and that will actually add to a worsening of the trade deficit, because we will the percentage change in price will be far greater than the percentage fall in quantity demanded, so therefore we will import more oil. But it will also it will also help to cause cost push inflation. So it will worsen the balance of payments and will also cause cost push inflation. And finally, if we do get inflation, then that will create instability in all sorts of countries. So if the inflation's abroad, say in China, that will create macro instability there. If that creates instability in those countries, they are less likely to bring in foreign direct investment into the UK. Now that's really, really important, because if we bring foreign direct investment into the UK, then that will help to pay for our trade deficit, as I've just explained about 3 or 4 minutes earlier. So inflation will affect the balance of payments, as will productivity. If we got very, very good productivity, which in the UK right now we haven't, I think our productivity is almost zero, then but if we do have high productivity, then our cost per unit fall, and we're going to sell more exports. And obviously right now we've got a fall in the exchange rate for all sorts of reasons, and that will make us more competitive, and so hopefully we'll sell more exports. So those are the factors that will influence the current account and the balance of payments. And what are all these consequences? Another part of the syllabus is the consequences of investment flows. Well, I've already given you one consequence, which is really, really important, is that it's very important that the UK attracts foreign direct investment, which will help to pay for our current account deficit. So therefore, attracting FDI is very, very important for the UK. Another investment flow, another story to tell is with the Asian crisis in 1997, where America and the UK and Europe pulled their money out of Asia because there was boom time, but then it was all going to go wrong. They pulled their money out, and that created the Asian crisis, and obviously demand fell in those countries. Now China learned its lesson from there and says whatever happens, we're not going to borrow money, we're just going to create money by creating a very strong economy that has lots of export-led growth, and the Americans will go up and buy up all our goods. Therefore we'll have a trade surplus, which I think in 1 year reached 12% of GDP. That is enormous, and with that money they've created a sovereign wealth fund, and they're now the ones who are lending to America. So that's the problem of investment flows. But it's also really good, but it pays for the UK trade deficit. But it's also really, really important because Africa is now going to take off big time. In fact, I'm going to go out there in a year's time, but it's really, really going to take off. And the reason why it's going to take off is because it will have lots of investment flows attracted from China, attracted from Europe, attracted from America. It's got the highest return on capital employed. Even Bob Geldof has set up a fund, and that's going to help the African economy develop. So even though it's money coming from big funds, right, hopefully that will create economic development, and we're just in the World Trade Organization, and hopefully those countries will not be exploited in terms of what they do. So this part is lesson 93. It's all about trade, and then we're going to stop there. Okay, lesson 93, and policies used to reduce the trade deficit. Fundamentally, this is quite easy, and we've already been through this previously, but there are 4 policies you can use. You can use supply side policies, because that improves every single macroeconomic variable. You can reduce AD, but we don't want to do that because that really, really hits growth, and it creates lots of unemployment. We can reduce the exchange rate, which is quite a good way, although that may create cost push inflation, and we have the Jacob effect, and the Marshall-Lerner equation will also come in there. And finally, we can use protectionism, but we really can't use that right now because we've got to abide by the rules of the World Trade Organization. We also have to abide by the rules of the Customs Union. So I've seen it used a whole lot of board here for not a lot of information. But they have this thing called expenditure switching, and what that is when you reduce the exchange rate, we call that expenditure switching, because what that does is by reducing the price of your exports, it switches demand towards your exports, and by raising the price of your imports, it switches demand away from your imports to home produced goods. So that's it. Expenditure reducing is another policy that we can also use. We can decrease aggregate demand, and if we decrease aggregate demand, that will then lead, so I'm just checking that on there, checking it's loading up, that will lead to a fall in imports. Right, so the next thing I want you to do is how that relates to other macro objectives. Well, supply side improves all of them because we've done that loads and loads of times. We can decrease AD, but that's going to hit growth and it's going to hit employment. We can decrease the exchange rate. That improves 3 of the 4 macro objectives. The only one it doesn't improve is inflation. And finally, we could use protectionism, but we really can't use that because we will be breaking the rules of the World Trade Organization, or we'd be breaking the rules of the Customs Union within the European Union. So fundamentally, like anything in life, you want to improve it, you use supply side. However, I would always argue right now, because our trade deficit is so large, we've got to decrease the exchange rate as well to rebalance the UK economy, but that's going to take a lot of time. And then although it creates inflation, we can use the supply side economics to solve the problem of inflation. That sounds incredibly easy to do when you say it, although in reality, of course, it's very, very difficult to have really, really strong supply sides within an economy. 3, and this is about the significance of trade deficits and trade surpluses for economies. Now, this is not a subject that you find in textbooks where they write a lot about it, and I don't think it's given the significance that it ought to be, because I happen to believe that a trade deficit is really, really bad for an economy. And basically it says that you're living beyond your means, and at some stage there's going to be payback time. So during the nice decade, our trade deficit got worse and worse, and our manufacturing sector got smaller and smaller and smaller, and that's going to have massive consequences for the future of the UK economy. Okay, at the time it was okay for the Labour Party because they continually got re-elected again and again. But fundamentally, I think we were living on borrowed time. However, in terms of the UK, as I said so many times before, because we've been able to attract a lot of foreign direct investment, then that paid for a lot of our trade deficits. All right, so these are the various trade deficits. UK has a trade deficit of roughly 5% in 2014. I think America's now is roughly about 6%. Greece has got a trade deficit of 10% and Spain a trade deficit of 11%. Now, if you look at those countries that are really struggling, Spain and Greece are suffering big time. The UK has had a trade deficit virtually every single year for the last 30 years, apart from 1 year, 1997. However, its trade deficits have been quite small, but they add up. But they've been about 2 to 2.5%. But we've been okay because we've been able to attract foreign direct investment. Okay, the countries in the world which have big trade surpluses are, as you would guess, those countries which now have more and more economic power. China has the largest trade surplus in the world. Germany has the second largest trade surplus, about 5% of GDP. China's has been as big as 12% of GDP at one stage. Saudi Arabia, all the oil producing countries also obviously have trade surpluses because they produce oil. So it gives them a certain amount of economic power. I'm not alone in this. The previous governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, says we need to sort out these economic imbalances, which is really the fact that we have a trade deficit and other countries have a trade surplus. So how can that happen? How can that be solved? Basically, the problem is the UK and the West spend loads of money. China saves, and because it saves, it has lots of investments, and because it has lots of investments, therefore it can produce more and more goods all of the time. So I think they do matter. Okay, what could happen about these trade deficits? Well, if we take the UK's case, Europe could increase aggregate demand, and if it did that, they'd buy more imports. So we're looking for a recovery from Europe to help out with the UK. We could ask China to increase its exchange rate by much more than it has done. However, China's not very keen on doing this because it's got all of its growth through export-led growth. So I'm just checking on there that the previous file is uploading. Japan has also had a fallen exchange rate despite the fact it has a large trade surplus. Now, the reason why it's done that is because it wants to stimulate growth within its economy, and as we previously said, they've got loads and loads of zombie banks in Japan, and that's why their economy is struggling at this moment in time. But one of the things that they tried to do is they've tried to decrease they've decreased their exchange rate to sell more exports, but they've got a trade surplus. And if the whole of Asia could increase AD, then that would help. But even then, it's really the UK's problem to sort out, I believe. So we have tried to sort it out by decreasing the exchange rate, which could be seen as a form of protectionism, and hopefully that will increase our exports. And also, obviously, by using supply-side economics. But we must try and get rid of global economic imbalances. They cause problems. And just as I'm talking, it's just flying into my head here that obviously in Europe there are very large global economic imbalances. Germany has a very large trade surplus. Greece and Spain, as I've outlined, have very large trade deficits. And that has created problems for their economies because Greece and Spain need to borrow lots of money to pay for those trade deficits. It's also meant that overall the Eurozone has a very slight trade surplus. Now that therefore means that its exchange rate will not fall. Right. So one of the other problems of having a trade deficit, if we think about the UK, is imports are greater than exports. So therefore that will probably mean that the exchange rate will fall. Stephen King, in his book called Losing Control, says that our exchange rate could actually fall by very large amounts when there's a run on sterling. People suddenly get really scared. They say, hell, UK, you've had a trade deficit now for 30 years. For 29 out of the last 30 years, your economy's in deep trouble, we're going to sell sterling big time, and it could fall by 30, 40, 50%. Now, clearly, if that happens, that is going to create a lot of cost push inflation. And the people in the UK will be wondering, what the hell's happened here? Why has our exchange rate suddenly fallen? And it's fallen because we've been living on borrowed time for the last 30 odd years. So trade deficits do matter. You're okay as long as you try and do something about it. And I sort of think the UK is trying to do something about it, but we can also be helped out by other countries by increasing AD or increasing the exchange rate. There is no reason why China should now be trying to increase demand in its own country. Right, and if it did that, then it'd buy more of our imports, which would help us a lot. So that's the piece on global economic imbalances. If you have to borrow money to fund a trade deficit, that's going to cause you problems, and eventually people may start to sell your currency, and that could cause a massive collapse in your exchange rate, and that creates instability and therefore less investment and everything else. So learn the syllabus. There's not a lot in the textbooks. However, trade deficits, I believe, do matter.